It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this morning. All eyes will be on the Chancellor today to see whether he'll put a spring in everyone's step by helping hard-pressed families in his mini-budget. Out for the government this morning, the Conservative MP Mark Harper, who will be with us shortly. I'll also be asking the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, and the former Labour Chancellor John McDonnell how they'd fix the crisis. Plus, with fresh reports that President Putin's forces could be stalling, we'll be joined by the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, Vadim Pushtaiko. It is Wednesday, the 23rd of March.
I'll bring you the latest inflation figures due any moment now as the cost of living crisis continues to bite, affecting prices not just at the pump, but at our kitchen tables.
All that as the Chancellor prepares to reveal his spring statement. Will he help families by cutting fuel duty or raising the national insurance threshold? Missile attack. Russian fire from a ship off the coast of Sevastopol as the Pentagon warns of increased activity in the Black Sea. A city destroyed. Ukraine's president says 100,000 people in Mariupol are without food, water or medicine and under constant bombardment.
I'm in central Ukraine, where the human cost of war is evident on every single street corner.
A game of two halves. William and Kate, all smiles in Jamaica, but protesters there accuse the royal family of benefiting from the blood, sweat and tears of slaves.
Mr. William, I see you love to dance with the black people and you love to frolic, but speak some truth on this trip. Speak truth for what it's worth.
2 years on from the first COVID lockdown, we ask the WHO, the World Health Organization, what the future holds. The Barty party is over. World #1 tennis star Ash Barty announces her retirement, aged just 25, in order to follow her dreams. Also ahead on the programme this morning, could your local chippy be under threat? I'll be speaking to the president of the National Federation of Fish Fryers with warnings a third could close in the cost of living crisis. And Gulliver's Travels. We'll be speaking to the Scottish couple set to cycle around the world on a tandem bicycle to raise money for hospices across Ukraine. Morning all. It is a very big day today as the Chancellor prepares to reveal exactly how he's going to help hard-pressed families survive the cost of living crisis. There are reports he could raise the national insurance threshold or cut fuel duty, and in the last minute we have had the latest inflation figures which will paint a picture of how much more families are going to get squeezed. Our business correspondent, Helen-Ann Smith, is at the petrol pumps where, of course, prices have been skyrocketing. Good to see you this morning, Helen-Ann. So, in terms of inflation, what were we expecting and what have we got?
Well, Neil, we were expecting inflation to be very big, very significant in the 6 months to February, and unfortunately the figures haven't disappointed. Inflation up by 6.2% in the 12 months to February. That's actually slightly higher than what economists were predicting. And to put that in some context, remember the Bank of England like to aim to keep inflation at 2%, so 6.2%, a hugely, hugely significant rise. There's a few pushers, a few factors behind this that we know about. Food and household services are really pushing up. We know about fuel and energy costs, very significant as well. But this is a really worrying figure for a couple of reasons, not least because, remember, this is the figure for February. And people have been talking a lot about the war in Ukraine and the impact that that's having on prices. And, of course, that has been very significant. It's pushed up the price of wholesale gas, the price of oil, and all that will feed through, unfortunately, to petrol prices and to energy bills. But remember, the invasion of Ukraine only came right at the very end of February, and this is the figure for February. So what happens in March, what happens in April when we know that the energy price cap is already going up and bills set to rise by over 50%, what happens in those months set to be even more painful, even more significant than this figure for February. Some economists have predicted that when we get to April, that inflation will be well over 8%, potentially even up up towards 10%. So really, really worrying times indeed. And this will be playing heavily on the mind of the Chancellor today as he delivers his spring statement. The very intensity of this cost of living crisis. Well, what was happening today was only meant to be a very short fiscal update, just a few numbers. It's been expanded into more of a sort of mini budget with proper measures expected. And that's because of the severity of the crisis that people are facing in their lives, people desperately struggling to afford to make ends meet. Remember, there's other causes to this as well, certainly not just the war for the February figures, things like the labour shortage that we've been hearing so much about, the problems in the supply chain, all of this stuff feeding through to businesses that put their prices up, that have to pass them on. So very worrying times indeed for lots of people.
Indeed. Helen Ann, many thanks. We will, of course, have full coverage of the Chancellor's spring statement throughout the day here on Sky News. Our live coverage starting in proper from 11 o'clock. And I am very pleased to say the Conservative MP, Mark Harper, joins us on the programme. Mr Harper, a very good morning to you. And I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but when I was considering the list of names that the government might put up for interview this morning, yours was not necessarily at the top of the list, and you will understand why. It wasn't that long ago that you were being pretty openly critical about Boris Johnson and perhaps his longevity. I'm just wondering, does your appearance this morning mean that you're back to being BFFs?
No, look, it's very clear. I obviously have had some differences with the government over the last couple of years about how it's handled the COVID pandemic. I would have preferred we'd got the economy firing on all cylinders a little bit earlier than the government. And obviously, before Christmas, I led a bit of a rebellion about the restrictions the government put in place. But actually, I think that was the right thing to do. I think it meant the government held its nerve over Christmas, and we've seen that the figures have remained the same. We've got the economy firing on all cylinders, and thank goodness we did, because it was only a few hours between getting all of those restrictions lifted and then we saw the appalling Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've gone from one crisis straight into another, which provides obviously a very difficult and challenging backdrop for the Chancellor as he sets out his spring statement later today.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does. But at the same time, you also did say, regarding the kind of the ongoing row about Partygate and who knew what and when in and around Downing Street, you did say that you wanted to wait for the conclusion of the Metropolitan Police's inquiry. We are not at that point. So again, I will say, it does rather feel that what is happening in Ukraine has perhaps, to some extent, shaped your view of the Prime Minister.
No, I've been very clear on the issues around how Downing Street dealt with the so-called Partygate saga. I've said I'm prepared to wait. The Prime Minister wants us to judge him on the facts. I've said I'll wait for the conclusion of the Metropolitan Police criminal investigation, which is ongoing, and the full Sue Gray report when she completes that and that's published. But that's a judgment, I think, for another day. We've obviously got this important Ukraine situation ongoing, and the government's obviously doing a good job on leading opinion on that. And then we've got the very important spring statement today. So Partygate hasn't gone away, but it's not for today. It's for a day in the future when the Met's finished its inquiry and the Sue Gray report is published.
Indeed. Well, let's get straight on to the economics of it all. And as you were just hearing, we have had those latest inflation figures. CPI up from 5.5 to 6.2%. Certainly feels like we may well be on track for 8% as predicted in April. Do you think it's an inevitability that we're going to hit double figures at some point this year?
Well, look, I think what is certain is that actually the economic picture is very uncertain because of what's happening in Europe with the Ukrainian situation. And I think anyone who thinks now they can forecast what's going on in the autumn, I think is likely to be wrong. I think what it does illustrate is the Chancellor's got competing pressures today. He understands the situation facing consumers and businesses, but he also needs to make sure that that inflation outlook, the fact that interest rate pressures are going upwards, debt interest is higher, and he also needs to build in some resilience to deal with whatever the future may throw at us. So those challenges, I think, are all competing and provide a difficult balancing act for today. And I think that's the judgment that I'm confident that he'll get right when he sets out his statement at lunchtime.
Of course, we have heard from the Chancellor, facing quite a lot of pressure over the pending increase to national insurance, that it will go ahead, that there is a necessity to it. I mean, you would concede, I'm sure, that the Cabinet is not united on this particular issue, let alone the party. I mean, is there perhaps some wiggle room for Rishi Sunak in perhaps tinkering with the threshold? in terms of national insurance?
Well, look, I can't comment on the specifics of what's going to be announced today, but I think on the national insurance rise, it's very clear. We've said we're going to put an extra £12 billion into, first of all, into the health service to deal with the backlogs that have arisen because of the pandemic, and then a long-term funding settlement for social care. If you're going to say you're against the national insurance rise taking place either this year or in the future, you've got to say whether you're prepared to not put that money into the health service or social care, or come up with some other way to pay for it. People that say they want to put off these rises but still want to go ahead with the tax rises, the spending increases, are just not being serious. So Labour, for example, want to cancel the
Chancellor doesn't have money to play around with.
But still want to spend the money.
It's not as if the Chancellor doesn't have money to play around with. I mean, estimates vary, but we are talking about tens of billions of extra revenue sitting in the Exchequer at the moment.
Well, I think one of the problems is everyone's looking at the upside points, and there may well be, I haven't seen the forecast, there may well be extra revenue, but I think people are forgetting there are also extra costs. So there are cost pressures on public services, and also we've obviously had to borrow a very significant amount of money, rightly in my opinion, to deal with the economic impact of the pandemic. But that means the economy is vulnerable to rises in interest rates and inflation, and we saw yesterday very significant debt interest payments. The Chancellor has to be mindful of that when he's making decisions. And, you know, we were able to help consumers with an announcement in February of £9 billion to deal with a big chunk of the rise in energy costs. That was only possible because the Chancellor had some resilience built into the system, and I think given the uncertain outlook for the rest of the year, I want to make sure that there's a certain amount of resilience built in so that we can deal with whatever shocks are thrown at us in the future, and the government can respond to help consumers and businesses cope with what the world throws at them.
Sure, but a very specific question. From your perspective, is this a point where the Chancellor could rely on extra borrowing, or should we be using these surpluses, and there are surpluses, to start paying down some of the debt?
Well, I think pretending that you can continue borrowing at the level that we have been over the pandemic, I think just isn't serious. We borrowed for a one-off shock, which was the biggest economic shock for 300 years. That was the right thing to do to protect millions of jobs and thousands of businesses. That was successful. If you look at the recovery from the pandemic, we've got some of the best numbers across the world. We've got a record number of people on payrolls. We've got very low unemployment. You know, businesses have started recovering. But we've got to make sure that we continue that sensible economic management and we build some resilience into the system to deal with whatever the world throws at us. So I think the Chancellor, I'm sure, will look to help consumers and businesses where he can and is on people's sides. But I think he's also got to be mindful of the very uncertain position coming in the future. And I think the public would expect him to build that resilience and that security into the public finances so that he can look at dealing with whatever problems arise in the future.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that the world, in your words, is throwing at us at the moment is, of course, the violence that we are seeing in and around Ukraine. Is there not a really strong argument for a significant increase in defence spending at the moment, particularly given the amount of munitions, materiel that we are providing to the Ukrainians at the moment?
Well, there is, and of course we had that very significant increase in defence spending in the budget. That was the largest increase announced in defence spending over the next few years for some time. And of course the government's integrated review had Russia as the top security threat. So
sure, that did rather precede the violence in Ukraine, though.
Yes, it did, but it recognised Russia as a threat. It was a very significant increase in defence spending, and we remain the second largest spender in NATO. What's been very welcome, of course, is that what's happened in Europe has meant that those European nations who haven't been spending the 2% of GDP, which we more than exceed, have also now decided to increase their defence spending. And what's important is that NATO as a whole has the resources and the funds to deal with the threats we face. So I welcome those increases, but we made a very big commitment to defence spending in the budget just a few months ago.
Can we talk about COVID briefly, Mr. Harper? It's 2 years now since the first lockdown. So many of us, of course, have been affected individually, personally. We will all know people who have been ill. Many of us will know people who have died. Indeed, we have a rather brave 13-year-old girl who'll be on the programme just a little bit later this morning telling us about her father who passed away. What lessons have you taken away from the past 2 years?
Well, I think, first of all, it's been a very difficult year for many people, and a huge number of people have had very, very difficult personal circumstances to deal with, and I'm very mindful of that. I'm also very conscious that, our scientists and our health services responded incredibly well so that we could develop the vaccines, get them rolled out, and we're now in a position where, with vaccines and the antivirals that we've got, we're in a position where we've been able to enable people to get back to normal, living with the virus. It's going to be with us forever. It's not going away, and we've had to deal with that, and I think the country, individual people, and some of our systems have responded very well. There will be lessons to learn, which is why I'm pleased that the public inquiry has been set up. The chair of that inquiry is consulting on the terms of reference. They're very broad. They'll look at the government's decision-making, the evidence, how it balanced things and weighed things up. And I look forward to that inquiry. I'll be delighted to give evidence to it in due course. And it'll set out, when it reports, the lessons to be learned for the future.
We do have to let you go, Mr Harper. Before you do, you'll have noted the Royals currently touring the Caribbean at the moment. They've been met by protests in Jamaica. Mm-hmm. Plenty of anger, plenty of speculation that Jamaica may well be preparing moves to make itself a republic. I'm wondering, given that, is now the time for the royal family to apologise for its role in benefiting from slavery?
No, look, I think the royal family leads or sets out these things very well when it goes on its tours. I don't think it's wise for the royal family to get involved in politics. That's a matter for the government, and decisions about the future of Jamaica's constitutional status are a matter for the people of Jamaica and the government of that country. It's a democratic country, and that's right and proper. I think it's much better if the royal family stays out of politics and leaves that to the politicians, and they maintain that constitutional status where they can unite the country. And I think from Her Majesty the Queen downwards in her Jubilee year, I think the royal family do that fantastically well.
Mr Harper, great to have you on the programme this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, Neil. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Well, let's take you through the front pages that we have this morning, and we begin with the FT. And according to the Pinkin, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is planning to set aside a large part of an unexpected £20 billion boost to the public finances this year, rather than using it to help families hit by the cost of living crisis. Here's the Mail. It focuses its attention on calls for the Chancellor to axe what's been branded the worst-timed tax rise in history. The Mirror leads with a plea for help from a struggling family to the Chancellor on the cost of the living crisis. Here is The Guardian. Ashes of a dead land reads their headline. Those are the words of Ukrainian officials who accuse Vladimir Putin's forces of indiscriminate fire on civilians in Mariupol as a mass exodus of the city intensifies. The Daily Telegraph reports that Ukraine has regained key territory, forcing the Russian army to retreat in several locations, but raising fears that President Putin may soon turn to chemical weapons. And here is The Times. It leads with a rather less hopeful headline on the Ukrainian arsenal running low. Ukrainian officials urging Germany and France to honour their pledges to send more arms. Still to come on the programme. As we look ahead to the spring statement, Labour's former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell will be joining us. That's just after 7:30. We'll be joined by Simon Williams from the RAC to talk about what Rishi Sunak can do in his spring statement to address the rising cost of fuel. And 2 years on from the UK going into its first national COVID lockdown, we will be speaking once again to David Nabarro from the World Health Organization. But before all that, Ukraine's president has accused Russia of sabotaging efforts to evacuate civilians from the besieged city of Mariupol. Volodymyr Zelensky says 100,000 civilians remain there with no food, no water, no medicine, and of course under constant bombardment. The MOD says that Russian forces remain static in the north of Ukraine and are likely reorganizing before launching another large-scale offensive. Western intelligence says the Russian military is also attempting to envelop Ukrainian forces in the east of the country. The Ukrainian agency responsible for Chernobyl says that Russian forces have destroyed a laboratory at the nuclear power plant that's responsible for the management of radioactive waste. And President Biden is expected to announce new sanctions against Russia when he visits Brussels for a NATO summit. Sky News has verified this video taken off the coast of Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea. It shows missiles being fired from a ship not too far from harbour. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said in a briefing Monday that the US has seen increased naval activity in the northern Black Sea. Well, these are the latest satellite images from Maxar Tech showing the extent of the damage on apartment blocks and factory buildings in Mariupol. Smoke can be seen in several of the images, with fires continuing to burn in others. The southern Ukrainian port has become a focus of President Putin's due to its strategic significance. Sky's John Sparks is in Dnipro and joins us this morning. John, good to see you. I suppose the best thing to ask for you is an update as to the very latest. We've just had the MOD briefing suggesting that in some parts of the country the Russians are regrouping, preparing for a large-scale assault. In other parts of the country, of course, it just feels like you're under a constant assault already.
Yeah, good morning, Neil. I think the MOD are right, certainly from our travels. We've just come back to Dnipro from the city in the northeast called Kharkiv, large city very close to the Russian border. And it was clear to us that the Russian assault has significantly slowed. Their military is essentially parked in the northern suburbs of that city, with both sides essentially taking pot shots at each other from the woods. It's clear to us that their advance has significantly stalled. I think it's also clear that the Russians have taken significant losses in terms of personnel, in terms of equipment as well. But there is intense fighting going on, actually not very far from here, about 200 kilometers to the northeast of Dnipro, in a city called Izum. It's in the Kharkiv region, the Kharkiv state. It's a small city, stands on the banks of the Seversky Donets River. Intense fighting over the last couple of days. Ukrainian troops trying to hold the western bank of that river. And there are also reports, unconfirmed reports, of very heavy Russian casualties as well. Again, with a note of real caution, but they are in circulation, reports of 400 dead Russian troops. Again, have to be cautious about that. In the southeast, in Mariupol, the horror continues there. I think the name of that city will live long in infamy. 100,000 people, according to the Ukrainian President Zelensky, 100,000 people in the center of that city without food, without water, without any services. The fighting raging around them, a small number of Ukrainian troops essentially fighting to the death in the middle of that city. We understand that about 7,000 people got out in a sort of ad hoc convoy, or a series of ad hoc convoys yesterday. Those people taking their lives into their own hand, taking the lives of their families into their own hands when they make that decision to leave the city. And the Ukrainians said they tried to send a humanitarian convoy into that city with the prior agreement of the Russians. The Ukrainians say 11 buses got into the city, and then the drivers of those buses, the emergency services workers on board, were then taken prisoner by the Russians. So really a very bleak situation down in Mariupol.
John, thanks very much indeed. A little bit of breaking news reaching us from inside the Kremlin. Dmitry Medvedev, a name you will probably remember, formerly president of Russia during one of those brief periods when Vladimir Putin became prime minister. He's been talking. He says this: the West has acted in a disgusting, criminal and amoral way in relation to Russia. The war of words clearly continuing. But let's turn our attention to royal news, shall we? And Prince William and Kate have been greeted by protesters in Jamaica. They're demanding an apology and reparations for slavery. Just a warning, this report from our royal correspondent Rhiannon Mills in Jamaica does contain flash photography.
For 4 days, they've been cleaning up Trench Town, ready for William and Kate to walk into the birthplace of reggae and into a country questioning what their future relationship with the royal family should be. Looking in, it's not a debate at the front of everyone's mind.
Yeah, I still want the Queen to be my Queen, because I born in July and Jamaica get independent in August. So I want the Queen to still be my representative here.
Yeah, we all feel great about it, It's coming to Trenchtown, you get me? Yeah, so that's it.
Many indifferent, just here to enjoy the spectacle and see other Jamaican stars like England footballer Raheem Sterling.
For you, growing up, how important was Jamaica's relationship with the royal family, and do you have much to say about the debates going on at the moment?
I don't want to delve too much into that. I think, like with everything, you have some people that might be, a bit frustrated with things that happened in the past, but on a whole, I think there's a lot of love for the royal family here. A lot of them.
These royal tours always have that mixture of the fun engagements, but also the difficult diplomatic work. And the fact that they've got involved isn't to downplay the big debates that are going on, issues that we understand Prince William is going to address in the coming days.
Before they'd even landed, protesters gathered outside the British High Commission, demanding that Prince William apologise for the role played by the royal family in slavery.
Mr. William, I see you love to dance with the black people and you love to frolic, but speak some truth on this trip. Speak truth for what it's worth.
On his first trip here, William is expected to acknowledge the painful past, but stops short of an apology. We wait to see if that in any way can satisfy his new audience. Rhiannon Mills, Sky News in Trenchtown.
Well, before heading to Jamaica, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge took the plunge to swim with sharks in Belize. This video posted to their official Instagram page shows the royal couple, that's William on the left, no, that's the shark, they're visiting the world's second largest barrier reef to see ocean conservation work being done there. In the video, Prince William praises the conservation efforts of the Belize government and local communities. Looks like a fantastic little trip for those two. Now, 2 years ago today, can you believe it? This happened.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households. That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes.
It feels a lot longer, but it was 2 years ago today that the country went into its first national lockdown. To mark the second anniversary, a series of events will take place across the UK. It comes as a comprehensive analysis of excess deaths in England and Wales has revealed that COVID caused fewer fatalities than in many other European nations. Our science correspondent Thomas Moore has more.
People haven't just died during the pandemic because of the virus, they've died of other causes too. And that's made clear by the most complete analysis so far of excess deaths. According to the Office for National Statistics, almost 134,000 more people died up to the end of last year in England and Wales than expected from the 5-year average. Much of that rise has been in men, up more than 17%. In women, the rise was just under 11%. Now, if you look at the timeline, you can see how excess deaths have fluctuated above and below the expected level, which we've zeroed on the chart. And you can see big peaks in April 2020 in the first wave and in January 2021 during the second. But strip out deaths due to coronavirus and the results get more intriguing. So there was still a peak in non-COVID excess deaths in that first wave here in light blue, probably because of a lack of testing meant some deaths really caused by the virus were attributed to other medical conditions on the death certificates. But excess deaths from other causes dipped sharply during the second wave, probably partly because lockdown meant flu and other respiratory diseases were at low levels. They then rose again and remained high for the whole of the second half of last year, probably because those respiratory diseases got going again in the autumn and lots of people were vulnerable. Overall, looking at the whole period, there were almost 7,500 fewer non-COVID deaths than you would expect. What really stands out is the difficulty people with underlying health conditions had in accessing healthcare. For example, deaths from dementia and Alzheimer's rose 71% at home, but they fell 31% in hospitals. And deaths from colon cancer rose almost 37% at home, but they fell almost 19% in hospices. When you look at a map, there's lots of variation in excess deaths, but no obvious geographic pattern and no clear link with deprivation. But there were slightly more than expected in rural areas and slightly fewer in towns and cities. So how does all this compare with other countries? Well, earlier this month, a study in the Lancet Medical Journal looked at excess deaths around the world, and they found the UK ranked 9th in Western Europe with a rate of just under 127 per 100,000 people. Rates were higher in Italy and Spain, but slightly lower in Germany and France. The pandemic has taken a dreadful toll on most countries, and understanding the statistics will be key to learning the lessons.
Thomas Moore there. Now, I thought I'd stretch my legs to show you a couple of the stories that have grabbed my attention today. Let's take a look at this in The Guardian. Now, it's carrying a special report on Alisher Usmanov, the Russian oligarch, once said to be the UK's richest person. He claims to have placed hundreds of millions of pounds of his assets into an irrevocable trust, potentially leaving them outside the sanctions regime established by the UK, the US, other Western governments. He is said to be connected to at least 6 luxury properties in the UK and 1 central London office building. Now, collectively, we are told that all of those buildings worth more than £170 million. Slight change in tone. Do you take a cheeky nap when working from home? Never. The Sun reports on a poll suggesting that staff switch off around 3 times a week. Wouldn't happen on the Sunrise Breakfast team. The research also found people take to social media for a scroll around 9 times every day. I think it's a bit more than that for us, I suspect. And they also send non-work-related messages 8 times a day. Yeah, I think I might be slightly higher than that total. But also in the Sun this morning, don't look down. Oh, God alive. These are pictures of people posing for selfies, hundreds of feet up in the air. The woman on the centre, if you can just about make it out, that's not the pole, that's her friend whose shoulders she's standing on a pole that, by my reckoning, looks no more than 2 foot wide. Rather them than me. Anyway, ahead of the spring statement later today, the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, will be joining us after this.
The surge in prices is squeezing all our finances. With rising fuel costs, inflation, and higher food bills, the cost of living is going up and up. How will the Chancellor's spring statement help reduce the cost of living crisis? The spring statement on Sky News.
Welcome back. Just a reminder as to our top stories. And inflation has risen to 6.2% as the Chancellor prepares to give his spring statement. The UK facing the greatest cost of living crisis in a generation. Ukraine's president has accused Russia of trapping thousands of civilians in inhumane conditions in the besieged city of Mariupol. 2 years on from the first COVID lockdown, the UK will be holding a series of events. Well, ahead of the spring statement later today, the Chancellor is facing calls to axe the planned hike in national insurance as families face a cost of living crisis. I asked the Conservative MP, Mark Harper, whether there were any plans to tinker with this.
The economic picture is very uncertain because of what's happening in Europe with the Ukrainian situation. And I think anyone who thinks now they can forecast what's going on in the autumn, I think is likely to be wrong. I think what it does illustrate is the Chancellor's got competing pressures today. If you're going to say you're against the national insurance rise taking place either this year or in the future, you've got to say whether you're prepared to not put that money into the health service or social care or come up with some other way to pay for it. People that say they want to put off these rises but still want to go ahead with the tax rises, the spending increases, are just not being serious.
As you can see, Tamara Cohen joins us in the studio. Good to see you this morning. Well, we just heard Mark Harper there saying, if you say you are against the national insurance hike, I mean, there are plenty of people that are against the national insurance hike within the Cabinet and within the Conservative Party.
There are plenty of Tories who are against the national insurance hike. One former Cabinet Minister told me it was suicidal to go ahead with it, given the pressures of massively increasing energy bills. We know they're going up by £700 this year, and inflation rising the cost of everything in the shops as well. The Chancellor has said he understands the acute spending squeeze on households, but we've had 2 years of big spending during COVID. We're not hearing him saying today he's going to do whatever it takes, as he said during COVID, to help people out of it. But he's announced a lot of support for energy bills already. We're expecting some more support today. I think most Tories don't expect him to scrap the national insurance hike, perhaps change the threshold to protect people at the bottom end. Also, some action probably on fuel duty as well. There's talk of a 5p cut, although whether that's enough really to touch the sides of how much extra money people are going to be paying this year is the question. He says it's all about security and making sure we have enough money there in case of massive oil and gas spikes later this year.
Thank you very much, TC. Someone with a view on all of that, I'm sure, the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, joins us live on the programme. Mr McDonnell, it has been a while, so I do hope you're well.
Very well, very well. Good to speak to you again.
So let's talk spring statement. If you have a crystal ball in front of you, you may well consult it, but also you might have a wish list. What do you want to see from the Chancellor today?
Could I just address Mark Harper's point? Because I think he's made a valid point. I would like the national insurance rise scrapped, but you have to say where else you could find the money for the NHS and social care. And a number of think tanks, including the TUC, did recommend to the Chancellor at the time, what you can do is basically tax wealth at the same rate as you're taxing income. So in other words, tax capital gains tax at the same rate as income tax. And that would bring in the estimate 17 billion. So actually it would be ideally suited to cover the amount that the Chancellor would want to raise. That's just as an aside, because I thought it was important that Mark made that point, that if you are going to scrap something, you've got to replace it with something else. And this could be the way in which you have a fairer taxation system. Well, the first step towards it anyway. I think the most important thing for me is you've got to protect people. You've got to inflation-proof, first of all, those people who are going to be hit the hardest in this coming months, and they're people on pensions and benefits, but also the low paid as well. And therefore, you've got to inflation-proof increases in pay as well. That's the first thing. The second, I do think it is about controlling prices. I think we need to make sure that we're capping the profits made by the energy companies. We saw the figures from the think tank Commonwealth that identified the profit rates of some of the energy companies as 42, 45%. In addition to that, I think we need to look at other prices that we have to control. The Mayor for London, Sadiq Khan, has said, let's have a rent freeze. I called for that last year. I think rent controls are part of it. And Andy Burnham up in Manchester, making sure now he has control over buses, we make sure that we prevent fare increases as well. So packages like that, where we protect people's incomes, inflation-proof them, then also reduce an element of the costs that are falling upon them, I think is absolutely key. The other issue for me as well, and I do criticise the government for this over a long period of time. Look, we need to go for green growth. And the first step on green growth in the way in which we can help people with their energy bills is insulation. We've been calling for this for over a decade. And if we could have capital investment in insulation programs now, it would increase the number of jobs that we've got. The predictions by about 450,000. It would insulate people's homes and reduce their energy bills. I think that's the sort of package I'd like to see today. And I think we've got to recognise how tough it is for people out there, and therefore they need assistance now.
Sure, I think both you and I would agree that if any of that gets into the Chancellor's statement today, you'll be a lucky man, Mr McDonnell. But I wonder what your view is of borrowing right now. I mean, you and I spoke an awful lot back when you were Shadow Chancellor, and you often got criticised with that phrase, the magic money tree. Given what we have seen over the past couple of years in terms of borrowing, I wonder whether you somewhat feel that your stance has been vindicated.
Well, it has, but, I told you so isn't a particularly good phrase, to be honest. I want to look to the future. I think what we've got to do is make sure that we're responsible in everything that we do. And the responsible way forward is to recognize that in times like this, there's real hardship out there. People are suffering. We're talking about people. It is true, people choosing between heating and eating. We're talking about people who've had their wages virtually frozen for nearly 12 years. It's tough out there. So yes, we've got to protect people in this short term. And that does mean an increase in borrowing in the short term. But the most important thing is, I said time and time again in our interviews, you borrow to invest. And that's why investment in alternative energy sources, in insulating our homes, is the right thing to do at the moment, because you'll reap such huge rewards. And actually, in terms of energy and alternative energy sources and insulation, you'll reap them pretty quick as well.
Sure. Mr. McDonnell, given our previous conversations, you might not be happy about this, but whenever we have talked, we've always ended up talking about what's going on within the Labour Party, and so it is again today. Recently, of course, you did pull out of the Stop the War rally after pressure from the Leader's office because of their stance over, the extent to which NATO is responsible for what is going on in Ukraine. Were you entirely happy to withdraw from that event? And genuinely, what is your view of the extent to which NATO is responsible, from Stop the War's position, for what we're seeing?
I withdrew my name for the statement and withdraw because the leader of the Labour Party said so, because also the statement was out of date. And I said then, we're in a war situation. What we don't want is internal political debates and discussions like that. And it would be a complete distraction from the focus that we should have on securing peace. We've got time to debate the issues around NATO and Russia and the long term. What we've got to do now, every word we use now has got to be about securing peace. And we shouldn't be distracted from that. Too many people are suffering at the moment. So that was my focus then. It's my focus now. And remember, people seem to forget, I was one of the people who helped set up the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign over 10 or 11 years ago. We were campaigning with Ukrainian trade unions and others, trying to secure the long-term democratic future of the Ukraine. I think that's the issue for me now. And I think there will be a time when we debate the security system for the whole of Europe in the future. What will reassure people? What will give us peace? Now, I think the focus has got to be on securing peace.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we can't even debate it here. John McDonnell, good to have you on the programme once again. Do take care.
Thank you.
Now, of course, with the cost of petrol reaching record heights, all eyes on Rishi Sunak later today to see what provisions he puts in place to help ease the ongoing cost of living crisis. Let's speak now to Simon Williams from the RAC. Simon, good to see you this morning. You, of course, taking the lead for the RAC on fuel. It's pretty horrific at the pumps at the moment.
It really is, Neil. The average price of petrol is now £1.67 a litre and diesel at £1.79. £91 to fill up an average petrol car and £97 for diesel. The cost of living crisis is being very much driven by the increase in the price at the pumps. We're calling on the Chancellor to take action today, significant action. He's talking about a 5p cut in duty, which I think will be a drop in the ocean. That will take us back to a price we paid this time last week. What use is that, really? It's something, but I think he needs to go further. In fact, he might be better off cutting VAT, because that's very much a tax on top of the 58 pence a litre we're paying in duty, and itself bringing in around 27, 28p a litre at the moment. So that a 5% cut in VAT would actually knock 7 pence a litre off of the pump straight away. And if prices go higher, he could go further too.
Just a random question that occurs to me, Simon. Of course, the REC has a number of functions, but I'm just wondering if you are seeing people, because of the prices at the pumps, people avoiding perhaps going to the pump for as long as possible and breaking down in increased numbers.
We haven't seen an increase in breakdowns in active fuels. People are pretty good at that. But obviously people are, we know from a survey we've just published today that 25% of people are saying they are having to cut back on other things to put essential fuel into their cars. A third of people are saying they're cutting out leisure journeys because of the expense. So this is really starting to hurt, and something needs to be done to ease the burden. We know how important driving is to this country, and obviously the price of petrol and diesel has really contributed to inflation in so many ways. Everything we have in our shops, all the services we have that come to our door, everything is moved by road and therefore petrol and predominantly diesel.
Simon Williams from the RAC. Great to have you on the programme this morning. Thanks for joining us. Now, the world tennis number one, Ash Barty, has announced her retirement from the game at the age of just 25. The Australian, at the top of her game after winning both Wimbledon and the Australian Open within the last 8 months, said that she was retiring to chase other dreams.
I'm so grateful to everything that tennis has given me. It's given me all of my dreams plus more. But I know that the time is right now for me to step away and chase other dreams and to put the rackets down.
Fox Sports News reporter Eloise Soye joins us now from Sydney. Eloise, great to have you on the programme this morning. Remind me, we've been here before with Ash, haven't we? This one feels slightly different, though.
Yeah, it certainly is a little bit different. Absolutely incredible news. And to be frank with you, we're still trying to understand it. The 25-year-old's announcement has come as a huge shock to many. And I suppose that's because of the recent heights she's reached, including, like you spoke of then, the Australian Open back in January and the Wimbledon last year. And while her talent on court speaks for itself, it's the champion woman and role model away from tennis that makes us as Australians so proud to call her ours. I mean, she really doesn't get any more Aussie in the fact that she's sponsored by Vegemite. She has also featured in multiple advertisements and campaigns for Tourism Australia. She was actually out at Uluru, one of Australia's most iconic and culturally important landmarks, after she won the Aussie Open to help Indigenous kids learn more about tennis and inspire the younger generation. And as an Indigenous woman herself, she's very passionate and involved in assisting Indigenous communities, and as that'll help her in her retirement, rather. As for what's next, well, she didn't reveal much, but as you said earlier, she has actually played cricket before here for Brisbane Heat in the Women's Big Bash League. She then returned to tennis and took it to a whole new level, and she's got a fantastic career, and also too in golf as a husband. So she's certainly got plenty ahead in her professional career, but we will see what lays ahead for Ash Barty.
Eloise, many thanks. Now, 2 years ago this very day, the Prime Minister told us at home. Now, on the anniversary of the first COVID lockdown, a series of events will take place across the UK. Joining us once again on the programme, Dr. David Nabarro, the World Health Organization's Special Envoy for the global COVID-19 response. Dr. Nabarro, always good to see you. And it has been a little while since we last chatted, which usually means that things have been going relatively well with COVID. 2 years on from the first domestic lockdown here in the UK. Globally, what's the picture like?
Well, we still are in the middle of a quite unpleasant pandemic. Other things have dominated the news recently, but my quick summary is the virus is continuing to move. There are still an awful lot of people getting sick and dying each week, and we cannot be complacent. I'd like to ask everyone, do continue, if you can, to wear face masks in crowded places. Do continue to maintain physical distancing. And if you are vulnerable, and that means if you've got other diseases, do please shield yourselves. And the most important way to do that is get vaccinated. We're living with the virus and it's still causing a lot of problems.
Dr. Nabarro, I don't know the last time that you might have spent any amount of time in London or anywhere else in England. Right now, it doesn't feel like anyone or very few people are adhering to those recommendations. And they remain recommendations for the government to keep our distance, to wear masks in crowded places. People aren't doing it.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Actually, I mean, I'm more of the time in France and Switzerland, and I have to say, certainly in France, people are being remarkably careful. I'm told by my children that it's a different situation in the UK. My only advice to everybody is just don't forget, remember that this has killed so many people and that it's still nasty. I don't want to get COVID, and I don't think anybody else should. You know, we're also learning about long COVID, which is when you get infected and you think you're going to get better, and then you've got several weeks of being unwell, under the weather, unable to do what you want to do. Here it is. People are the solution to this pandemic. Let's do what we can to not let it get ahead of us again.
I mean, I was speaking to someone kind of involved in the public health response here in the UK, a couple of days ago. What does it look like? What does living with COVID-19 actually look like? And they said, look, it's going to be lots and lots of people catching it, some of those people getting ill, but crucially, very few people actually losing their lives. I mean, is that what living with COVID looks like for you?
I hope so, but to reach that point and to stay there, we have to all be up to date on our vaccinations. After you've been vaccinated, the defences in your body gradually fade. And for some people, older people like me, the fading is a bit quick. So I have to say to everybody, keep your vaccinations up to date. You should certainly have got 3, and perhaps you should be thinking about a 4th if you're in the older community. And so with that up-to-date vaccination, with being careful on not exposing ourselves, we'll live with COVID, but from time to time we'll have a few scares.
Dr. Nabarro, I want to ask you about something that I saw in the papers the other day. Another vaccine that is being developed at the moment, the world's first plant-based vaccine that we're told. The report suggested that the WHO would reject that vaccine because the company developing it is half owned by the tobacco giant Philip Morris. I mean, what is the truth of all of that?
So I cannot answer that question. Okay. There are complexities there, but I do want to say to everybody, new vaccines are going to go on being developed from lots of different sources, and we need to be ready for real strides forward in the whole area of vaccinology, including through the technology you described.
Just in terms of testing, do you still feel that mass testing has a role in the Western world right now?
Well, as I've said, the virus is the problem, people are the solution. You can't solve the problem and live with COVID if you don't know where the virus is. And so if there's one thing I'd like to ask all governments to try to maintain, that is easy access to testing. We always say that if the proportion of people who test positive in a country rises above about 10%, then there's not enough testing being done. There are many countries in Europe where there should be more testing done. In that way, we know what's going on. In that way, we keep ahead of the virus.
Dr. David Nabarro, always good to see you. I hope you and yours are well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye all.
You guys can stay right where you are. Plenty more coming in the remaining 2 hours of the programme. Join us at the top of the 8 o'clock hour as inflation hits a 30-year high, just, of course, as the Chancellor prepares to deliver his spring statement later today. Will there be any rabbits from that? Well, we'll soon find out.